Hi, everyone. This is Jason Bierek of Wall Street for Main Street. Welcome back to another Wall Street for Main Street podcast interview. Today's special guest is a first-time guest, but I followed his work and his interviews for a number of years now. Really enjoy listening to his interviews. It's Jeff Deist. He's president of the Mises Institute. Let me just read his bio really quick. For many years, he was an advisor to Ron Paul and a tax attorney specializing in mergers and acquisitions for private equity clients. He was also Congressman Paul's chief of staff during the 2012 election and his press secretary in Congress from 2000 to 2006. So thank you very much for your time and for joining us on a Wall Street for Main Street podcast, Jeff.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Now, Jeff, let's talk about your background a little bit before we talk about the Austrian viewpoint of the economy. What got you interested in libertarianism, and how did you find the Austrian School of Economics?
Well, Jason, I guess I'm lucky in the sense that I had a father and an older brother who were both fairly liberty-minded. I recall as a teenager my dad having a copy of The Road to Serfdom in the house, and I also recall this would have been the 1980s, my older brother getting Reason magazine. So I had some family connections, and at the time, later I was in California and became involved just very briefly with the Libertarian Party, and over time developed into a pretty hardcore libertarian. I would say by the time I was halfway through college. So I'm pretty much a lifelong libertarian, never went through a left or right-wing phase per se.
Very, very good. So you were a libertarian before the internet then, before it became easy to find the information.
Well, I'm well into my 40s, Jason, so yes, I was a libertarian before the internet in those dark, dark days. But you got to say that the internet has been an unbelievable equalizer. You know, the state governments and folks of all stripes like to talk about democracy, but they don't like the reality of democracy so much. And by democracy, I mean the democratizing effects of cheap communication across borders.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I was an MBA student for a year. I took the normal business school classes. I told you about this before we started recording. And I was learning Austrian School of Economics. I had seen Peter Schiff. Peter Schiff on TV predict the stock market crash and also the real estate bubble collapse. And I'd seen Ron Paul, and I was like, these guys make a lot of sense. And I just started researching in 2007, 2008, 2009 the Austrian School of Economics, and the information was there when I started looking for it. The Mises website came up, which is a great resource, one of the best ones out there, probably the best one out there. It's just so much information available for free. I learned Austrian School of Economics by watching over 100 long lectures that you guys put up there for 30 or 40 minutes on your YouTube channel, and it's just amazing that now we have this, despite the fact that when I was in an MBA program, you ask a professor about the Austrian School of Economics, there's no books in the libraries, Jeff, about any of this stuff, really, in really any business school library. It's like the Keynesians and the other people in power just pretend this doesn't exist.
Well, I think that's true when you're talking about mainstream academia. Fortunately, the books and the literature do exist, and they're very easily findable for average folks. And I think that's really one of our goals, and a big part of our mission is doing an end run around traditional academia and reaching out to individuals, to lay people, to stay-at-home moms, to students, to soldiers, to truck drivers, really average folks who are interested in Austrian economics. And we have to remember that when I was a young guy, you might have had a chain bookstore in your neighborhood or in your town, and that bookstore might have had Milton Friedman's Tree to Choose. It probably had John Kenneth Galbraith. It might have had some Ayn Rand books. That was about it. You couldn't get Mises or Rothbard at your bookstore. You certainly couldn't get it at your local library or at your town's university library even. So when you compare today to those dark times, we're really way ahead of where we were. And one of the things we pride ourselves on at the Mises Institute is making as much Austrian literature available free in the form of PDFs or HTML files on our site.
Yeah, I remember listening to Lou Rockwell podcast and Robert Wenzel during the dark days of libertarianism, before the internet, that there was really only like a fax list, and there was a mail publication, for a libertarian newsletter. I think that was occasionally written by Charles Goyette or Ron Paul or Murray Rothbard that occasionally, would go out once or twice a month or something like that. And now, in the days now where content is cheap, there's just so many more great young and old and middle age, like of different backgrounds and different places where they live, libertarian authors that are coming out of the woodwork.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good thing. It's a healthy thing. And what's interesting to me is that many people today are finding Austrian economics through libertarianism. In other words, they're already libertarians. They have libertarian friends. They attend libertarian events. They follow liberty-minded organizations, think tanks, etc. And from that interest in libertarianism or the interest in Ron Paul 2012, whatever it might be, they find Austrian economics because they hear it referenced, they hear it mentioned. But it's interesting to note that for much of the 20th century, that process was reversed, right? In other words, a lot of people who termed themselves classical liberals at the time were learning about Austrian economics, were reading Mises and Hayek and later Rothbard. They were introduced to Austrian economics from giants like Leonard Read, who founded FEE, and through reading Austrianism, they later became libertarians or anarchists. So the process is reversed, but it's still a very happy turn of events in the sense that I think growth in the form of interest in the Austrian school has never been higher.
Now, I wish Washington, D.C. was interested in the Austrian school, but I think really only Ron Paul and maybe a handful of other congressmen in Congress have any interest or have read any of the books whatsoever. I want to talk about your time there in D.C. as Ron Paul's chief of staff. You lived here a number of years in this area. We were talking about this before. What's your impression of the welfare warfare state here in D.C.? Is there any way to slow down this Leviathan yet, or is basically this thing going to run its course and it's going to basically destroy itself?
Well, I'm not sure that there is a political path forward to turning Leviathan back a bit. I think there is a path forward. It might require a series of nasty shocks in the form of what we all believe is happening to the dollar or to the economy. But it's important to understand that people in Washington, I would call them loosely the political class, meaning politicians, lobbyists, lawyers, and the businesses, the contractors that make a living off of FedGov. Not only are they not versed in economics, they really have no interest in it. It's completely foreign to them. As long as the Fed can paper over deficits and keep the whole thing churning along for another 3 months or 6 months or 12 months, in a strange way, everyone is happy. And Washington really is an alternate universe. It's hard to describe unless you've been there and worked there. But the people who come to Washington from all over the country, many of them used to be mayors. They used to be county commissioners. They used to be local, on city councils. So it's, as Rothbard said, it's no crime to be ignorant of economics, but it is a crime to be professing economic solutions or remedies when you are ignorant. So we're in a very tough situation. People in Washington have no incentive to do what we as libertarians would like them to do, which is mostly pack up their things and go home. So, am I optimistic about the political process per se? No, I'm not, especially having been there. But I am optimistic about the educational process, and I am optimistic that millions of Americans, and really, frankly, millions of Westerners and even Easterners, are starting to turn their backs on the state. Slowly but surely, they're starting to understand that governments, especially social democracies, which is what we live in, are simply ill-equipped to handle the big structural problems of the world today. So my optimism is really born of reality, of just pragmatism and the fact that the state is groaning under its own weight.
Yeah, Washington D.C. is a utopia of rent-seeking myopia. It's just so much like they believe, all their statistics. They change their formulas. They believe so much in everything. You have you mentioned the political class here. I would add to those a lot of the bureaucrats here, which are so much of the government budget. They can't. I mean, even when Reagan took over, he tried to defund some of these government agencies, but he did grow government in some agencies and things like that. But the stuff he tried to cut and defund, he wasn't able to because the budget is already pre-programmed, pre-spent out for years in advance. And some of these government bureaucrats, they have 3 paper degrees, they have PhDs, they're making some of them over $100,000, full benefits and things like that. they're going to keep voting for the central planning and the thing they want. They're not going to vote for something that's necessarily going to take away their paycheck and things like that. And, it's going to be very tough, like you said, for a political solution to come along. I personally think the political process, Jeff, is broken. There's very little difference, in my opinion, between the Republicans and the Democrats, despite, the stuff you hear on MSNBC or CNN or Fox News or things like that. Those differences are cosmetic. I just see them as two rival gangs of pirates that just agree, where to spend the taxpayer loot and from all the inflation they're getting from the Fed and other places.
Well, it's true, and I would say that it scarcely matters, frankly, who's president. It scarcely matters who's in Congress, and it scarcely matters what the federal courts do. The practical reality today is when we talk about the government, meaning the federal government, what we really mean is the federal executive agencies. 95 to 98% of the employees of the federal agencies do not change when administrations change. And frankly, they often ignore the flat express will of Congress. In other words, if a federal agency like the IRS or the SEC comes along and ruins your life, for the average American, what is your recourse? Do you have 10 years and millions of dollars to fight them in court like Mark Cuban did when the SEC accused him of, made a bogus accusation of insider trading? Well, no, the average American's not like Mark Cuban. He doesn't have teams of lawyers and years to clear, in Mark Cuban's case, his reputation. But for a lot of us, something.
They're like our own chef, right?
Yeah. So it's not a good situation for the average person in the sense that voting or having a certain person elected to office is probably not very likely to make much of a difference.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I mean, even if Ron Paul had won the presidential elections he had run for in the last couple elections, I mean, you work with Ron, and you worked in the government, what would he have been able to get done? I mean, there would have been lobbyists, there would have been so much amount of corporate lobbying and also special interest groups and the government bureaucrats fighting him, just delaying things, coming up with new schemes or things like that to wait him out, right? Because, these government bureaucrats, like you said, a lot of them have, they basically can't get fired unless they commit a felony. So they're looking at things, from 5 or 10 years out. They're thinking, I'll just wait this politician out. This politician's stupid. He's making my job harder. I don't want to do anything he says, and I'll just wait it out here, and we'll go right back to the status quo after that.
Well, I would just say this. If Ron Paul had been elected president, that would have indicated a sea change in the attitudes of the American public, and I think you would have seen huge swaths of Congress removed from office as well. But I absolutely understand one person certainly can't do it all, but I think what Ron did was far more important than actually being elected.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jeff. I mean, he you just saw him get character assassinated so much from all the different networks. He hardly got any time. I mean, I've heard the stories about how, it was his turn to speak and they just cut him off and things like that. And, there's a status quo apparatus. They don't want him talking. And I thought he did a great job, standing up there and delivering his message. And, if he could wake up 5 people or 10 people, I think that was like his goal, right? To wake up young people like me and others, right?
Oh, there's no question about it. And what's so interesting to me about that campaign was that he could give the exact same speech to a bunch of kids at UC Berkeley and a couple days later give the identical speech to a bunch of white Mormon kids at Utah State and say the same things. We should end the drug war. We should get out of Iraq and Afghanistan. We should radically scale back government snooping. And, a bunch of conservative kids and a bunch of progressive kids, same applause from both audiences. So, there's no, the Ron Paul revolution was largely a millennial revolution. In fact, in our office, in Ron's congressional office, we oftentimes had high school or college kids coming in with their parents who were, let's say, baby boomers. And it was the kids who were driving, and the parents were becoming interested in the Ron Paul revolution because of their kids. So it's sort of the opposite of what you might expect.
Well, I've tried to get my parents to look at some libertarian stuff, and they do agree that they don't like paying a lot more taxes, but some of the other libertarian related issues they're not so sure about. But I guess you can find common ground with a couple issues here or there, and maybe plant seeds. But my sister, I planted some seeds in her about different things about libertarian culture, and she's started researching this stuff. So it is I think my generation, the internet generation, where they'll spend 5 minutes or 10 minutes looking up some topics and things. It just comes more naturally to them that some of these things make sense, whereas the baby boomer generation, they're not as a lot of them are not as technologically savvy, or they fear technology and change, and they're not as open to going and looking at 10 different articles on the internet for an hour or something like that, and seeing if these things make sense. But I think eventually they will, as the Fed and Wall Street keep doing stupid things to the economy, and there's more inflation and things like that.
Well, sure, the baby boomers, they did change the world for better or worse. And there's no question that they, especially as they get into their Social Security years, they may not skew as libertarian as we might like. But look, there's been a lot harder challenges in life. And if you look back over history, the history of the state, the history of human liberty, there's never been a time where people necessarily had it easy, where there was no impulse towards a central controlling state. So, you and I certainly have nothing to complain about. I think we ought to be optimistic, and I think we ought to be pragmatic. I think we ought to be bold, and I think we should be unapologetic and just proceed and do as much as we can in our lifetimes without an air of entitlement, and understand that liberty is an ongoing and a constant struggle.
I completely agree, and that's why I put out this podcast here, and I have great guests on like you and Lou Rockwell and other Mises Institute people. We're actually interviewing Douglas French later in the week too, so we're gonna keep trying to educate people on Austrian School of Economics. Now, I want to ask you about Wall Street's view of Austrian School of Economics and gold. It just seems like Peter Schiff goes on TV on CNBC. Peter Schiff and Ron Paul go on Bloomberg and CNBC, and they're just absolutely blasted. Normally they're not even given the right amount of time to speak as some of the other guests. They're called names, they're character assassinated, their arguments are normally torn to shreds. What's your opinion on the level they're treated? Does Wall Street even understand any of the stuff that Peter Schiff and Ron Paul talk about when they go on there, or is there an inherent bias maybe to the point where they don't want them even speaking at all because they don't want anyone to wake up and start questioning the normal mainstream Keynesian beliefs?
Well, they don't want the party to come to an end, that's for sure. And when I say the party, I mean the Fed-fueled speculative stock market. And look, if there was no Fed providing the mother's milk of malinvestment, and if there was no FDIC backing up bank deposits, then the stock markets, the New York Stock Exchange, would serve a noble purpose. In other words, it would serve as a clearinghouse that allocated capital to its best and highest use. So there's nothing inherently evil about a stock market. It's just the Fed that makes it so. And when I see Jim Cramer, when I see Larry Kudlow, when I see Maria Bartiromo on the financial shows, I just view it as an infomercial for the markets, which is all it really is. And we've got a bunch of Fed-created monetary base that has mostly gone into the balance sheets of Fed member banks, but a lot of it has also gone into the equity markets. This is Austrian Business Cycle Theory 101. Newly created money and credit doesn't necessarily flow evenly throughout the economy. It certainly hasn't flowed into wages. And it hasn't flowed into CPI as rapidly as it has flowed into equities, but nonetheless, it is starting to be felt very strongly in CPI. Governments, of course, about which the government lies. So
they'll just change the CPI, right? They'll just keep coming up with new formulas for unemployment and the CPI and the formulas.
So Wall Street is casino capitalism. It is crony capitalism, but it need not be. And I think we're going to find that what constitutes markets in the future, especially if we have a dollar crash, is going to look very different.
Yeah, the original purpose of the stock markets, Jeff, like you said, was for companies that wanted to grow, that wanted to create real products and services, real value, real job growth on Main Street here in the U.S. So Wall Street benefited from that. So Wall Street and Main Street in the past with stock markets, their interests were aligned. So the underlying company could grow, create more products and services. Main Street would grow and get more jobs, and Wall Street would collect fees and help that facilitate that growth. But right now, like you said, casino capitalism. I mean, Wall Street's just the money is on the bank balance sheet, but these banks are also getting the money so they can go and speculate in stocks and bonds, and they're doing all kinds of crazy leveraged real estate deals where hedge funds can borrow at zero, and they're buying up entire streets of houses and things like that. Like even in the DC metro area, we have construction cranes everywhere now, and they're drastically overbuilding this area, considering how much permanent job growth there is here from the government. It's just really amazing that they've basically blown up, even more bubbles again after 2008. I really thought after 2008 that, the ticking time bomb, the clock was going to run out. But it seems, I guess there's just so much incentives in place. The people in power, the people who make a lot of money off the status quo, they want to believe that, 2008 was not the cure. That 2008 was just like an aberration, and that it's fixed, and we can back to recovery and things like that.
Well, the cure, of course, would have been to let firms and banks go bankrupt in 2008. But I noticed you bring up the term Wall Street as part of your show and part of your theme. If I could recommend only one book that would really help most people better understand what happened in 2008 and what the Fed does generally and what crony capitalism means generally, it would be David Stockman's book, The Great Deformation. And he really makes a strong case that what he calls the BlackBerry Panic of 2008, meaning Wall Street suits at Lehman Brothers and Goldman Sachs and their cohorts in the Treasury Department, that this panic would not have infected Main Street, and that this was basically just a cronyist bailout of politically favored interests that had nothing to do with saving the economy for the average mom and pop or the average Joe. So it's really that book is a fascinating account of behind what happened behind closed doors during those critical couple weeks when Lehman Brothers couldn't meet its daily cash needs.
Yeah, I haven't read that book yet, but it's something I definitely want to check out. But I mean, we can't have free markets or capitalism, right, without letting firms fail, because we have to have the right incentive structure in place where the firm, keeps cash. They do the proper amount of due diligence. You worked in private equity, so you know about proper amount of due diligence, and that wasn't being done with the mortgage rates, with the mortgage-backed securities and all the other things that were being securitized and garbage financial products that were being created and dumped on pension funds and things like that, because I guess they just all assumed that the bailout was going to come. And then when Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns didn't get the bailout, then everything just collapsed and the bond markets just started collapsing and things like that. But that's not real free market. That's not real capitalism, even though we have a group of people, a lot of mainstream people who work on Wall Street, people who haven't read von Mises or Rothbard, who will say that was free market capitalism in 2008 despite all the bailouts and things.
Sure, and one of the biggest forms of that bailout was the Fed buying up not just Treasury debt, but also mortgage-backed debt that Fed member banks held. So in effect, a lot of banks with toxic debt portfolios were relieved of that burden, and it now sits on the Fed's balance sheet to be disposed of, perhaps never. So, all we did was put a Band-Aid on things, and unfortunately, the fact that the Fed has tripled the monetary base just since 2008 certainly indicates that the next crash, the next bubble, will be that much more severe and that much more painful.
Exactly, and Fannie and Freddie also got, guarantees on all the garbage that they were holding in their portfolios, which was, garbage, bad loans, and they're back to doing bad loans again. I think they're almost back to no money down loans in some instances. And then, the amount of stuff, the Ron Paul one-time audit that Ron Paul is actually able to, audit the Fed. That's one of the first things I learned about Ron Paul. I was like, well, what is this audit the Fed concept? And then 2008 happened, and then we found out, later when Ron Paul got that one-time partial audit of the Fed, they had given out, $16 trillion, and that's only a partial audit, and that's all we know about. I mean, everything is just so opaque, and it's an insider's game, and it's behind the scenes. of all this money that's being printed. I mean, there's currency swaps now, Jeff, that are being given out between U.S. and Europe and the U.S. and Japan. These things could be trillions of dollars each year that are secret backdoor bailouts and stealth quantitative easing now between these developed world governments that are being given out in addition. It's just amazing.
Well, it is amazing, and I think U.S. taxpayers are blissfully unaware that they're in effect bailing out the euro in the form of inflation here at home. But look, that's why people just need to read. That's why people have to understand money and banking. It's probably the single biggest issue that faces all of us on a daily basis, both in terms of economics and also tangentially politics. But yet, how often do you hear candidates talking about the dollar or what constitutes a dollar or what monetary policy should be? No, you hear them talking about gay marriage. You hear them talking about abortion. You hear them talking about guns or the Keystone Pipeline or whatever. So politics really has become an almost quasi-comical form of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
Yeah, it's turned the political game, Jeff, and you can comment on this since you worked more in politics than I did, although I did do some political stuff and I have a political science degree, one of them. But it seems to me that, they just play on emotions, that, they know. I think if you sat down like off the record and you had a beer with a couple of these Congress people or some of their aides or I've even had conversations with banking lobbyists. I knew a couple years ago, and they would tell me, off the record, they would say, oh, no, the fiat money is the problem. This debt is just going to keep growing larger. No one wants to do the right thing. Both parties don't really, they may talk about cutting this or that, but when things get bad, they just come up with a new spending program, new Keynesian stimulus program, and that's the real problem. But, when push comes to shove, they won't do the right thing. And it's just amazing, though, that they just play in the game like the political emotion game for people. They don't want to lay out the rational argument to the American people and say, look, either we can have short-term pain really bad right now, but long-term we can have a real recovery and our debt won't be too much and we could build a sound economic footing again, or, we could just keep kicking the can down the road for as long until the Russians, the Chinese, and these other countries, take away the dollar as the world's reserve currency, which I think at some point in time is inevitable.
Well, isn't that funny how one of the big progressive critiques of capitalism is that it creates a short-term mentality where companies are only concerned with the bottom line in the next quarter? And, of course, we know that that's completely false. It's completely the opposite. What capitalism does is it encourages capital accumulation, which requires profits, a dirty word amongst progressives. It's actually politics which gives us short time horizons. In other words, all the political class cares about is the next election or getting by with the economy until if you're a lobbyist, until your company gets its payoff. It's really politics that not only divides us but also makes us such high time preference individuals. It's really a tragedy that we've allowed this phony game of democracy to make us forget about the long-term interests of our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And there's also, like you said earlier, a problem with the incentives. And the incentive problem is all throughout society. So you have like the SEC and other government bureaucratic agencies that have set up incentive structures based on, shareholder bylaws and things like that, where the people running the companies and the board of directors only get paid on boosting earnings. So then instead, the unintended consequences that these bureaucrats and other elected officials have put in place is that they take too much risk and, they load the balance sheets with debt. And they don't care if long-term necessarily they're making sound investments because they're trying to get their stock options and their bonuses and things like that. So that's another play there where government and the government agencies have, hurt the private sector in addition to the government growing bigger and larger, like you said earlier, too. There's just so many instances where the government has stepped in and made things just that much more. I mean, even Obamacare now, right? Obamacare is going to make it so much more difficult for the entrepreneur and the small businessman to want to hire someone full-time. There's just not the incentive to do it anymore. We're going to start seeing, like in France, maybe you've already seen this in France, but you're probably going to see this in the U.S., where small businesses start firing people to get around these Obamacare laws and coming up with, little schemes and things like that, instead of smartly, prudently increasing their employees full time and things like that, and making investments.
Now, isn't that amazing how it seems like for so many businesses, life has become a two-step process, one of rent seeking and two, avoiding or skirting or circumventing new laws and regulations. I mean, talk about the mother of all disincentives are way below market interest rates. I mean, at this point, what company, what individual for that matter, wants to just save money for saving's sake, for the sake of accumulating capital, when we know that Fed inflation, monetary expansion, and frankly CPI are both wildly outpacing the kind of savings that the average person is going to get. So there's no incentive for individuals or businesses to save for the future. And frankly, if you want to keep ahead of inflation, you almost have to go out and really try to scheme and game the market, because you have to make 5, 6, 8% on your money just to outpace inflation.
Yeah, I completely agree, Jeff. And I think we're starting to see that crack-up boom that von Mises wrote about. It hasn't happened in the real world yet in prices, at least in the developed world, in the U.S. and Europe. We are having inflation clearly. Maybe it's 8% or 9%, like John Williams of Chaucer says. Maybe it's larger in certain things due to the Cantillon effect. But we are seeing enormous inflation in the developing world, those other countries that have been running dollar pegs and things like that in China and India and Russia and Brazil, and we are seeing enormous amounts of inflation created in the asset markets. So in whether it's real estate or bonds, so these governments like Japan or Europe or the U.S. who have artificially suppressed interest rates can keep their bond prices high and their interest rates low, and also in the stock market, so they can sell to the American public, the people on Main Street, that the stock market is going higher, so there must be an economic recovery. There is no inflation. There is job growth and things like that. It's just all like it's kind of getting ridiculous to this point. It's gone on a lot longer than I think. I have no idea when it's going to end, but eventually people, because it's just gotten so disassociated with reality, people are going to wake up and there's going to be some common sense, I think, eventually.
Well, Jason, if you do know when it's all going to end and you can time it, you'll be a very, very rich man. That's all I have to say.
I thought there is some basic math problems. The U.S. doesn't have the easiest basic math problems right now. Japan has the worst basic math problem right now. So Japan's been doing this Keynesian garbage for even longer than the U.S. has with the stimulus programs. They bailed out their banks and all that other stuff. So Japan's at the point where their tax revenues are getting to the point where they can barely pay their interest payments on their debt. So we're gonna see a currency event probably in Japan first, and that'll be like potentially a preview of the end of the Keynesian endgame, as I call it.
Well, yes, and talk about a society with bad incentives. Look at Japan. That's become not only zombie banks, but zombie individuals. It's very, very hard for young people to go out and marry, to buy homes for themselves. People have to work very, very hard. So from the outside, a lot of people think that Japan is a very prosperous and orderly society, and in many ways it is. But on the inside, it is literally rotting from demographics and from 20-odd years of what we now call Abenomics.
I agree, and you can't really be an entrepreneur there in Japan either. If you have a new business idea, you basically have to leave the country, because they have a seniorage type apprenticeship type of system where you have to pay your dues for many, many years and work your way up the large corporation company ladder, and then even then your ideas might not get listened to. So the young people there, the really good technology entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley that the United States has, that they attract immigrants from. Japan doesn't have that type of innovation there. Although there are large corporations do innovation, but just not to the scale the U.S. does.
Yes, and if there's ever a cautionary tale that you could look at in microcosm, it is the demise of the once great Sony Corporation. This is a company that was run by brilliant, hardworking people, and unlike a lot of American companies, this is a company that had not, next quarter plans or next 5-year plans. This is a company that had 50 and 100-year plans, a company that absolutely dominated the consumer electronics market and was the gold standard in consumer electronics, TVs, etc., not all that long ago. And now it is a shell of its former self, and you have to wonder if it isn't a metaphor for the Japanese society.
Yeah, I agree. I think their market cap has fallen 80% since the tech bubble. It's an enormous collapse considering, other technology companies like Apple and stuff have rebounded and done very nicely. Well, Jeff, I want to thank you very much for your time. Please tell listeners more about the Mises Institute, your podcasts or events, and you just recently updated the Mises website, right?
Indeed. Today, which is Tuesday, November 18th, was actually a momentous day here. We've been working on a new site for about a year. And when I say working, it's just a huge data migration problem, because we had so many books, articles, videotapes, speeches, audio files, you name it, to bring over So we have a new Mises.org, MISES.org. Please take a look. Take a look around. Send us your comments if you have any, and we would welcome any and all viewers to the site who want to learn about Austrian economics.
Yeah, it's probably the best resource out there for learning the Austrian School of Economics. There's just so many free ebooks and lectures and audiobooks and stuff. And even if you want a hard copy of the books, it's a very affordable price. And you guys also have sales in the Mises store. I take advantage of those when I can.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you again for your time, Jeff. I just want to give our listeners a quick update on our Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign. We're over 40% financed after only 10 days, so we have January 5th to raise all of our money for Indiegogo crowdfunding campaign. And if we don't raise all the money, then we don't get to keep anything. So please keep your donations coming in, and we thank you very much if you've already made one.